of innovation in mystery and suspense fiction, we need look no further than the figure of the private eye. The major contribution of American hard-boiled fiction to the genre, the private eye is different from the classical version of the detective in terms of motivation, methods, lifestyle, and beliefs. The private eye embodies the preference for action over analysis, cynicism over optimism, and an acceptance that closure isn't always possible. But like the classical detective, the private eye is also a celebration of individualism and control over our destiny and the world around us. This lecture will be dedicated to examining both the similarities and the differences between the private eye and what came before, as well as describing the impact this figure has had on the genre of mystery and suspense fiction as a whole. A good place to begin our investigation is Raymond Chandler's seminal essay, The Simple Art of Murder, in which Chandler celebrates hard-boiled crime fiction in general and the figure of the private eye in particular. Some of the most famous words in the essay come in its closing section, when Chandler attempts to describe the kind of man that populates hard-boiled mystery tales. Down these mean streets a man must go who is not himself mean, who is neither tarnished nor afraid. The detective in this kind of story must be such a man. He is the hero. He is everything. Chandler is describing an ideal. If we compare his description to the private eyes that actually exist in the work of writers like Carol John Daly, Dashiell Hammett, Mickey Spillane, and even Chandler himself, we'll be struck by the gap between ideal and reality. But the ideal persists as a gold standard that both the private eyes themselves and their readers use to evaluate reality. Even though any given private eye will inevitably fall short of the ideal, we'll see that one of the admirable qualities of this figure is his persistence in trying to make a difference in a world that constantly is telling him to quit. As with any other notable innovation in the genre, there has been a great deal of debate among critics and aficionados about the origins of the private eye. Although not everyone will agree, there does seem to be consensus about the fact that the inventor of the hard-boiled tale and the inventor of the private eye are one and the same, Carol John Daly. Daly's first hard-boiled tale, The False Burton Combs, was published in the famous magazine Black Mask in December 1922. Knights of the Open Palm, an anti-Ku Klux Klan yarn that was the first story to feature Daly's private detective, Race Williams, followed in the same magazine in June 1923. Although Black Mask's editor reportedly did not care for the Race Williams stories, they were enormously popular with readers, and Daly published a huge number of them in the 1920s and 1930s. By the 1940s, however, Daly's work had fallen out of fashion, and when Mickey Spillane started his phenomenally successful career with Mike Hammer, a character with more than a passing resemblance to Race Williams, Daly was apparently quite bitter about it. Spillane, to his credit, acknowledged Daly's influence, was a huge fan of his work, and even wrote him a fan letter, which seems like a very un-Spillane thing to do. Why is Daly's work such an important part of the private eye genre? A quote from the opening section of Knights of the Open Palm can answer that question. "I do a little honest shooting once in a while, but my conscience is clear. I never bumped off a guy that didn't need it, and I can put it over the crooks every time. Why, I know more about crooks than what they know about themselves. Yep, Race Williams, private investigator. That's me." This is a very rich passage in terms of highlighting the distinctive qualities that made the figure of the private eye new and different. First, he speaks to the reader in his own voice, because Unlike the classical detective, he has no need for a sidekick. Second, his manner of speaking is very informal and quite unlike the educated discourse of the classical detective. The private eye talks in the same way as many of his readers, which is part of the reason this figure became so popular so quickly. Quite apart from the way he talks, as the archetypal private eye, Race Williams also has a clear preference for action over analysis. Although many of the cases he gets involved in are quite complicated, and he's certainly capable of thinking, the decisive resolution of a Race Williams story typically involves violence of one kind or another. In other words, instead of his brain, it's the private eye's superiority when it comes to brute physical force that guarantees his success. One of the things that sets Race Williams apart from his private eye successors is the kind of cases he tends to take on. Rather than straightforward or even complicated murder investigations, Race frequently finds himself in the middle of convoluted blackmail plots involving violent tension between family members, one of whom is often a young woman who needs Race's protection. The frequency of this type of plot in daily stories indicates his debt to dime novel conventions. Not far removed from the heyday of the dime novel, historically speaking, many Race Williams stories share the dime novel's fondness for melodrama, the Gothic, mysterious houses, and villains who practically twirl their mustache and roll their eyes to signify how villainous they are. Compared to the clipped, subdued style we'll shortly see in Dashiell Hammett's work, the prose in Daly's private eye stories is often a violent shade of purple. But the blackmail plots featuring vulnerable young women also tend to crop up in Race Williams stories for a different reason. Even though Race is often tempted to give these young ladies more than a comforting pat on the arm, he always restrains himself. Why? This is where we encounter a surprising similarity between the private eye and the classical detective. Although their reasons for doing so may differ, both figures are emphatic about the fact that they must reject emotional attachment in general and romantic love with women in particular if they are to do their job effectively. The private eyes and the classical detectives' shared suspicion of emotion and sentiment suggests another, perhaps even more fundamental similarity between these two figures. They both personify a type of individualism that borders on isolation. This isolation may be imposed upon them by the nature of the work they do, its danger, insecurity, and so on. But on the whole, both classical detectives and private eyes seem to choose their isolation willingly. Rightly or wrongly, they see this isolation as the price they need to pay to be both effective at their jobs and to control the world around them. With this point in mind, it's instructive to now turn to the next major figure in the private eye pantheon, Dashiell Hammett's Continental Op. The Op first appeared in print in Black Mask in October 1923, just a few months after Race Williams's first appearance. Despite the many similarities between these two characters, there are also some instructive differences between them. For example, though the Op appeared in 36 short stories and 2 novels, Red Harvest and The Dane Curse, Hammett never gave him a name. Why not? Partly because Hammett wanted the Op to remain something of a cipher. No matter how often we see him, the Op always retains something of an air of mystery about him, something that Hammett will work even harder to create when he invents the character of Sam Spade. But this is just part of the story. The other part is acknowledging that the Op does in fact have a kind of name, but it's a name that is simultaneously a job title, the Continental Op. This indicates that this character is an operative of the Continental Detective Agency. In other words, unlike Race Williams, Sam Spade, Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe, and Mickey Spillane's Mike Hammer, the op is not self-employed. He is an employee. Why is this an important detail? Because the op's status as an employee will presumably limit, if not cancel out altogether, his ability to be an independent individual, the quality that's so fundamental to what it means to be a private eye. Well, that's the theory, but how do things work out in practice? In Red Harvest, when the op arrives in Personville to do a job for his client Elihu Wilson, he's there as a representative of his employer. It soon becomes clear, however, that even though the op is meant to report back regularly to head office for instructions, to all intents and purposes, he acts as if he were self-employed. Even when his employer becomes concerned about the op's failure to report and sends 2 other operatives to check up on him, the op continues to go his own way and to approach the case as he sees fit. So despite technically being an employee, the op is a maverick and acts as if he controls his own destiny. Part of what's going on here is that Hammett wants to illustrate the tension that exists between the figure of the private eye and the employee of a large organization. The former is the antithesis of corporation thinking, so it's no wonder that the op resists being controlled by his employer. On a deeper level, however, Hammett focuses on the tension between the op's identity as a private eye and his identity as an employee to show us how, unlike Race Williams, who's always in control, the op gets in over his head. The private eye, it turns out, doesn't always know best. In fact, the op should have listened to the advice of his boss and his colleagues. We see dramatic evidence of this when the op wakes up one morning after getting drunk the night before and finds his hand around the handle of an ice pick that's buried in the chest of the dead woman lying next to him. Unfortunately, the op has no memory of what happened the night before, and both he and the reader have to confront the possibility that he may be a killer. Part of the reason why neither the op nor the reader can reject out of hand the idea of the private eye as a killer is that the op realizes that something is wrong with him. As he gets more and more deeply involved in his efforts to clean up Personville, he begins to realize he might be enjoying this gruesome work a little too much. And he says at one point, "This damn burg's getting me. If I don't get away soon, I'll be going blood simple like the natives." At moments like this, not only do we glimpse the similarities between the private eye and the criminal, but we also understand that the private eye can actually be a vulnerable figure who possesses more depth than we might at first assume. The op eventually concludes his work in Personville successfully and returns to head office, where, the op tells us, they gave me merry hell. Nevertheless, the spectacle of the private eye's near dissolution in Red Harvest is likely to remain with us for a long time. We see this same combination of surface control and vulnerability hidden at a deeper level in Hammett's most famous private eye character, Sam Spade. The Maltese Falcon is quite possibly the most famous private eye novel ever written. And much of the reason for that fame is that Hammett brought a level of authenticity and realism to the private eye narrative that it had never before enjoyed. Having worked for the Pinkerton Detective Agency for a number of years, Hammett was able to draw on his experiences extensively in his writing. In one of his earliest published essays, entitled From the Memoirs of a Private Detective, which appeared in the Smart Set in March 1923, Hammett offers 29 brief anecdotes and insights from his Pinkerton years, My favorite anecdote is that he knew a man who once stole a Ferris wheel. But if Hammett's own personal history gives a novel like The Maltese Falcon a dimension that other examples of hard-boiled fiction lack, there's no doubt the other major reason for the novel's fame is the character of Spade. Just listen to how Hammett introduces us to Spade in the opening words of the novel. Samuel Spade's jaw was long and bony, his chin a jutting V under the more flexible V of his mouth. His nostrils curved back to make another smaller V. His yellow-grey eyes were horizontal. The V motif was picked up again by thickish brows rising outward from twin creases above a hooked nose, and his pale brown hair grew down from high flat temples in a point on his forehead. He looked rather pleasantly like a blonde Satan. This is a great example of how Hammett will characterize Spade throughout the novel. The key here is that the reader appears to be given a lot of information, but in fact is told very little. What does it mean, for example, to describe Spade as a blonde Satan? We can guess, but we can't know for sure, because Hammett never takes us inside Spade's head. Instead, Hammett's third-person point of view consistently describes Spade's actions and facial expressions, but the meaning we're meant to attach to these things remains as ambiguous as the expression blonde Satan. In Hammett's work, the private eye, just like the Maltese Falcon itself, becomes a source of mystery and not just the person who resolves mysteries. Just like a conventional source of mystery, Hammett gives us clues that encourage us to guess what's going on beneath Spade's placid and confident exterior. When he sweats after confronting a young gunman, for example, or when his hands shake after a dramatic argument with master criminal Caspar Gutman, or when his eyes burn when holding femme fatale Bridget O'Shaughnessy, we feel like we're getting some insight into what makes Spade tick. But again, we can't be sure what it is that we're finding out. There are two incidents in The Maltese Falcon where Hammett lets Spade's mask slip for a moment, allowing us to see into the heart of his private eye. Interestingly, one of those incidents stresses Spade's similarity to the criminals he's ostensibly opposed to, while the other involves Spade's attempt to persuade both himself and someone else that he really is honorable. After a chain of events much too complicated to summarize, Spade finally gets his hands on what everyone has been looking for, the Maltese Falcon. A ship's captain brings Spade the Falcon and then promptly falls down dead on the floor of Spade's office. Ignoring the dead body, Spade unwraps the package, and then Hammett describes his reaction when he realizes that the Falcon is his. Spade laughed. He put a hand down on the bird. His widespread fingers had ownership in their curving. At this moment, Spade's delight makes him morally equivalent to everyone else who is chasing the Falcon, and thus erases the difference between the private eye and the criminal. As if to remind both Spade and the reader of this fact, Hammett then finds a masterful way to remind both of us of the dead body on the floor. His last backward step had brought his left heel into contact with the dead man's hand, pinching a 1/4 inch of flesh at a side of the palm between heel and floor. Spade jerked his foot away from the hand. Whenever I teach the Maltese Falcon, I always say to my students at this point that a lesser writer would simply have said, Spade trod on the dead man's hand. But there's all the difference in the world between that banal sentence and what Hammett writes. That pinched 1/4 inch of flesh evokes the dead body that Spade's already forgotten about so vividly that it serves as a rebuke for forgetting the ethical code that should inform the work of the private eye. That ethical code occupies a central place in the climactic episode of the book, when Spade must make the most difficult decision he's ever made and turn Bridget O'Shaughnessy over to the police. When Spade explains to Bridget why he has to do this, we get a strong sense that Spade is trying to convince himself as much as Bridget. It's clear there's a big part of Spade that wants to spare Bridget and say, to hell with the consequences. But he can't do it, for personal and professional reasons, and because for the private eye, the personal and the professional are so closely intertwined. Carol John Daly's Race Williams finds it relatively easy to turn down the temptations personified by women, but not so Spade. He admits that he only knows how to relate to women physically, and we see ample evidence of that in the Maltese Falcon. What makes Bridget different is that no matter how unlikely this seems for a hard-boiled private eye, Spade loves her, and this makes Bridget dangerous. In this sense, we could say that Spade turns Bridget over to the police, not in spite of the fact that he loves her, but precisely because he loves her. Are we meant to admire Spade's decision? Like everything else in the Maltese Falcon, the meaning of Spade's act is ambiguous, but the reaction of Effie is telling. She's not only Spade's secretary, but also the novel's moral compass. Even though she knows Spade did the right thing, she can't bear to have him touch her. And it's possible that this rejection wounds Spade more than anything else that happens in the novel. If we recall Chandler's description in The Simple Art of Murder of the ideal man who populates private eye narratives, it's clear that he had Hammett's work in mind. For that matter, Hammett himself acknowledged that Sam Spade was an ideal in his introduction to the 1934 Modern Library edition of the Maltese Falcon. Spade had no original. He is a dream man in the sense that he is what most of the private detectives I worked with would like to have been, and what quite a few of them, in their cockier moments, thought they approached. Despite the fact that Chandler admired Hammett's work enormously, when we compare Chandler's Philip Marlowe to Sam Spade, we cannot help but be struck immediately by the differences between them. Consider, for example, the famous opening paragraph of The Big Sleep, in which Marlowe describes his appearance. I was wearing my powder blue suit with dark blue shirt, tie, and display handkerchief. Black brogues, black wool socks with dark blue clocks on them. I was neat, clean, shaved, and sober, and I didn't care who knew it. I was everything the well-dressed private detective ought to be. We can tell immediately that this is Chandler, and that this passage could not possibly have been written by Hammett. How? Let's start with the fact that it's written in first person. Unlike Hammett, who insists on keeping his reader at arm's length from his private eye, so that we have to struggle to figure out who Spade is, Chandler gives us an all-access pass to Marlowe's every thought. Thanks to this access, we also notice nuances about how Marlowe feels about himself that we couldn't note in a similar passage about Spade. For example, we can see a tendency towards self-deprecation in Marlowe's description of himself, or at least a tendency not to take himself too seriously. In addition, the fact that he refers to himself self-consciously as a private detective implies that Marlowe is aware of his professional identity. It suggests that this identity means something to him that it does not to Spade. But what is that something? The clue comes when Marlowe enters the Sternwood mansion and starts up a conversation with the youngest member of the family, Carmen Sternwood. When Marlowe tells Carmen that he is a sleuth, she assumes he's making fun of her. Why? because by the time Chandler wrote The Big Sleep, private eyes had become a cliché, something you see in films or read about in books, but not someone you meet in the flesh. Over the course of this lecture, we've moved from Race Williams, a character that signified modernity with a vengeance through his attachment to violence rather than analysis, to Marlowe, who by contrast seems like a man out of time, the personification of an ideal that is now considered to be outdated. And that, of course, is exactly how Marlowe likes it. He not only embraces the fact that he doesn't belong in his current environment, he also accentuates his out-of-placeness through his adherence to a chivalric code defined by loyalty and chastity that is proudly out of step with the times. Consequently, when Marlowe makes a move on a chessboard later in the novel and comments that it was all wrong because it wasn't a game for knights, it's important to recognize that this is not a lament. If anything, it's an expression of Marlowe's determination not to fit in during a time that he believes is defined by corruption and decline. For this reason, being a private eye is the perfect job for Marlowe. It allows him to romanticize and dignify the isolation that has always defined what it means to be a private eye. But now, for someone like Marlowe, that isolation becomes a badge of honor rather than a limitation. And yet, Marlowe is also a realist. He understands that no matter how isolated he wants to be, the private eye will inevitably become part of the corruption. When he decides that his loyalty to his client, General Sternwood, trumps the need to make sure that the general's daughters pay for their crimes, Marlowe says with some justice that, I was part of the nastiness now. But perhaps Marlowe is being too hard on himself. In the words of police procedural writer Ed McBain, the last time a private eye solved a murder was never. Despite Chandler's championing of the hard-boiled private eye as the epitome of realism in the simple art of murder, perhaps it would be more accurate to say that there was always something inescapably romantic about the idea that a single individual could make a difference. From this perspective, Marlowe's decision to give in to the inevitability of corruption can be read as an integral part of the private eye's limits, rather than an individual failing on Marlowe's part. But with this said, we must also acknowledge that the fantasy of the effective private eye proves to be remarkably durable in mystery and suspense fiction. At the same time that Chandler was writing an extended eulogy to this figure in his work, Mickey Spillane was getting ready to launch a spectacularly successful career with Mike Hammer, his retooled version of the private eye. Devoid of the ambiguity of Sam Spade, and with none of the self-doubt and melancholic introspection of Philip Marlowe, Hammer would make Race Williams look like a pacifist thanks to his fierce commitment to killing as many people as possible in any given adventure. Predictably, both critics and other writers in the genre absolutely loathed Spillane and Hammer for, as they saw it, appealing to the lowest common denominator. Influential critic Malcolm Cowley described Mike Hammer as a homicidal paranoiac, and atrocious and nauseating were some of the kinder words used to describe Spillane's writing. Spillane's response to such criticism was typically forthright. Those big-shot writers could never dig the fact that there are more salted peanuts consumed than caviar. If the public likes you, you're good. I'd agree with Spillane in that you can't simply dismiss lifetime sales of some 225 million books by demonizing the author, the character, and millions of readers. Obviously, people found something deeply appealing about Spillane's version of the private eye. Whether it was Hammer's absolute conviction about matters of good and evil, his way with women, the way he kept his promises, his brutally effective approach to problems and challenges, his impatience with the system, his fondness for vigilante justice, or all of the above, Spillane demonstrated that even the most apparently worn-out elements of mystery and suspense fiction can be revivified if you're willing to do something that has never been done before. The other thing that we can take away from the popularity of Mike Hammer and the other private eyes we've looked at in this lecture is that we'll always respond to the idea that one person can make a difference. Even though private eye narratives have become synonymous with pessimism and cynicism, we'll keep coming back to them. Why? Because the private eye, despite everything, never gives up, and we can't help but admire that.